First of all, I want to apologise for the fact that I've been unable to attend any of the conference today due to other commitments, including having to participate in a fairly gruelling session for the Irish Planning Institute annual awards. But I gather also a matter of great regret that I wasn't able to be here to hear the exceptional contributions that I gather were made by so many of the speakers. And I also want, in case nobody did this already, I want to pay tribute to the Dublin Civic Trust for the sterling work that it has done over the last God knows how long, particularly its excellent reports on different streets like Capel Street and Thomas Street and other places that might easily just be forgotten. I was in Fitzwilliam Square last night, in the area of Fitzwilliam Square for a buffet in Colm Regan's house at number 25 Upper Fitzwilliam Street, which has the unique distinction, I think, in the Southside Georgian core of being the only, perhaps the only house that has remained in continuous occupation since it was built in around 1820. And walking around the area afterwards, I was struck once again, as anyone would be, by how vacant and depressing it is after dark. I mean, here is one of the great architectural set pieces of Dublin, and when you walk around, there's nobody there. There's nobody there. It's like the Marie Celeste or something, you know. Some of the houses in use as offices are floodlit, which really is about compensating for the lack of light that's coming from within. But I think, you know, the question arises, like, what meaning do these houses have if they're not lived in? Because to me, they're the equivalent of whited sepulchres, especially the floodlit ones, because there's nobody in behind those windows at all. I think we all know at this stage, and there's nobody in this room who would disagree with it, that the Georgian streets and squares of Dublin are part of the essential Dublin. Dublin would be incredibly impoverished as a city if it wasn't for the work of the Wide Streets Commissioners and the great estates that developed the city in the late 18th and early 19th century. And nobody nowadays would agree with the ridiculous and outrageous statement that was made by an unnamed government minister in 1958 after the demolition of the houses in Kildare Place behind the Shelburne Hotel, including one that was designed by Edward Lovett Pearce, by the way, a beautiful house from the early 18th century, where the unnamed government minister said, "I was glad to see them go. They stood for everything I hate." I mean, you can just hear the atavism of ages in that statement. But I think it's also clear, and I think that's one of the messages that has come across from this conference today, that Georgian Dublin needs to be re-inhabited, especially on the south side, because the south side has suffered most from office conversions of these houses. And I'm not necessarily saying that we should go for some idealized situation where each house would be a separate family home, you know, with its own army of servants and whatever else, because such a thing is really almost unimaginable at this stage. But I think that there are some excellent examples in North Great George's Street, for example, where houses have been converted back into residential accommodation at the rate of one flat per floor. There are other arrangements that you can come up with. I mean, it's not beyond the ingenuity of architects to devise ways of doing this. And really, we've been on about this for years, you know, re-inhabiting Georgian Dublin. And, you know, I don't know whether any of you remember, but Fianna Fáil, believe it or not, launched a policy document in 1996, just a year before they came back to power, pledging to make Georgian houses come alive again, as family homes. But nothing whatever was done during the boom years. It's important to remember this. Nothing whatever was done during all those years of prosperity to encourage the re-inhabitation of the squares. And in any case, property values, such as, I have to put that in quotation marks, would have made that prohibitive because there was no way people could have afforded to buy the houses for conversion into residential accommodation. The government, as you know, has introduced schemes of tax incentives for Georgian parts of Limerick and Waterford to encourage, with the very specific purpose of encouraging family living in the Georgian core areas of those cities. And obviously, it's an open and shut, no-brainer case that this needs to be extended to Dublin, particularly to the North Inner City, where the need is greatest, and then extend it to the South Side after that. And I think that well-targeted tax incentives are effective. There is no doubt about that. Just look at the example, the incredible success of the Bike to Work scheme, which is very largely responsible for the fact that there's been a 40% increase in the number of commuters cycling to work since 2006. And as for the notion that people in the Department of Finance would hold to, that the tax incentives would cost money, and the real truth of the matter is that any loss to the Exchequer is largely theoretical, and because there really would be nothing much happening otherwise. You're talking about things that wouldn't happen, incentivizing, having incentives to try and make them happen, and then you're talking about a theoretical loss of revenue. You're not talking about an actual real loss. And don't forget that in any building project, all the VAT that's paid goes to the Exchequer, all the PRSI and PAYE that's for the workers all goes to the Exchequer as well. So, it's a win-win situation, I think, for both the Exchequer and for the city. And the experience from elsewhere is very important. Edinburgh, for example, where the Georgian core was never abandoned as a place to live, unlike the South Side Georgian core in Dublin. Most squares in Dublin, particularly the Georgian squares, are really fantastic resources to have. We should reflect on this. How more impoverished the city would be if we didn't have these great squares. And I'm including St. Stephen's Green in that, which is, of course, a quintessential Victorian public park. And they've all come out of that fantastic legacy of enlightened planning from the late 18th century, brought about by the Enlightenment, the kind of ideas that led to the development of the new town in Edinburgh and other great urban legacies elsewhere in Europe. Parnell Square, where we are this evening, has fantastic potential if it could be read as a square. Unfortunately, it's just been subject to all sorts of higgledy-piggledy add-ons and additions and bits and pieces of this and that, to such an extent that it has lost any kind of real legibility as a square, as things stand. But I think it will be helped enormously by the decision to locate the Central Library in the former premises of Coláiste Mhuire, just on the other side, the north side of the square. So I wish we could end this conference today by having a ringing declaration. I think there is a declaration, isn't that right, Geraldine? Yeah, okay. Which I presume we'll adopt by acclamation in a moment. But Geraldine was really thinking about it along the lines of the Dublin Crisis Conference in 1986, which I was involved in along with so many others, like the late Deirdre Kelly, the late Kevin B. Nolan, the late F.X. Martin, the late, I was nearly going to say Victor Griffin, but he's still alive. And, at the end of that 3-day conference in the Synod Hall in Christchurch Place, we ended up adopting a resolution which called on the Dublin local authorities and the government to recognise and accept that the city is in crisis. And then we adopted a 10-point programme or something like that. It could have been a 15-point programme for all I know, for all I can remember from then. But in any case, it was regarded as total heresy at the time. Heresy. calling for an end to the inner city road schemes, repopulation of the inner city and all sorts of other things. Cycle routes, more emphasis on public transport, etc., 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 etc. All regarded as heresy then, but all of which has since become part of public policy. That is the most remarkable change of all. And a lot of other good things have happened, and we have to recognize that as well. I mean, the most important thing really has been the dramatic increase in the population of the inner city. I mean, here was an area, that sort of egg-shaped area between the two canals, which was in relentless decline since the 1920s in terms of its population. And it has now recorded a dramatic increase from a historic low of about 75,000 in 1991 to about 130,000 today. And that's no mean achievement. I mean, Mountjoy Square was in bits in the 1980s. The late F.X. Martin famously devised a circuitous route when he was meeting friends at Dublin Airport from visiting academics from more civilized countries. And he had to devise a circuitous route to bring them into the city centre that would avoid the horror of Mountjoy Square, where virtually two sides of the square were falling down, if not already gone, despite the efforts of the great people like Marie Guinness and others to try and save what was left of it. But the square is complete again. I mean, to a superficial eye, as it were, it would seem fine. But, we know for a fact that behind much of the facadism that has taken place on the square in the last 20 years consists of shoebox flats built by Zoe Developments and without any or hardly any architectural input whatsoever. And if you think of the dimensions of a standard Zoe apartment, which is kind of like 35 to 45 square meters, which is like, think about swinging a cat, not much space to swing a cat in rooms like that. And then, of course, because you have the additional height to have the Georgian proportions, you end up with something that looks like a cell, really, rather than a place to live. So I think what's clear is that we need a more targeted living city initiative, backed up by meaningful, structured incentives, quality standards, and also joined-up thinking from central and local government. We have to remember that this is no mean city. The Georgian heritage that we have is as good as, if not better than, what survives in other places. And really, all we need to now is to make the streets and squares come alive. So I would now invite you, first of all, to adopt the declaration of the conference, and secondly, to a little bit of housekeeping from Graham Hickey. Thank you very much.